Some places are priced by men who see only broken wood, but heaven measures a shelter by the lives it keeps warm. The rain over Hollow Creek, Vermont, came down in thin silver lines, soft enough to look harmless and cold enough to find every seam in a man's coat. Nathan Cole stood outside the small law office on Maple Street with one hand resting on the head of his German shepherd and the other holding the strap of a faded duffel bag that carried almost everything he owned. He was 40 years old, a white homeless veteran with broad shoulders, a square weathered face, short dark brown hair touched with gray at the temples, and light stubble along a jaw that seemed shaped by years of holding back words. His faded army jacket hung damp over a plain gray shirt, old jeans, and work boots worn pale at the toes from miles of pavement, gravel, and cold mornings that had begun before hope did. Beside him stood Atlas, 6 years old, black and tan, strong and alert, with upright ears, amber eyes, and a dark service harness fitted across his chest. Atlas did not fidget in the rain. He watched the law office door the way trained dogs watch the one place a day is about to change. Nathan had slept the night before in his pickup behind a closed laundromat, waking before sunrise to the sound of rain tapping the roof and Atlas breathing steadily in the passenger seat. The call had come from Clara Bennett, a local attorney whose voice carried that careful kindness people use when they are about to reopen a room in someone's heart. Eleanor Whitaker was gone, she had said. Nathan had not heard her name in nearly 3 years, but it entered him immediately, like warmth remembered by cold hands. He had met Eleanor during a snowstorm on Route 14, when her old Buick slid to the shoulder with a flat tire and no cell signal. Nathan had changed the tire while Atlas sat beside her door, keeping watch as snow gathered on his harness. Eleanor had invited Nathan to her house for tea. He had refused politely, because pride can make warmth feel dangerous when a man has lived too long without it. She had pressed a wrapped biscuit into his hand anyway, and told him that kindness should never leave hungry. Now her attorney said Eleanor had left him something. Inside, Clara's office smelled of paper, raincoats, and lemon polish. A brass lamp glowed on a walnut desk, and the windows were fogged at the edges. Several people sat in the room already. 2 distant relatives with folded arms, an older man in a tweed coat, and Roy Maddox, the local land broker Nathan had seen once at the gas station, smiling at people the way a man smiles at fence posts before measuring a field. Roy glanced at Nathan's wet jacket, his duffel bag, then Atlas, and gave a thin smile that carried no welcome. Clara Bennett rose from behind the desk. She was in her 50s, with dark blonde hair pinned neatly back and reading glasses hanging from a chain. "Mr. Cole," she said, offering her hand as if he were expected, not pitied. "Thank you for coming." Nathan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Atlas sat beside him without command, his gaze moving once across the room before settling on a cream-colored envelope lying apart from the other papers. The reading was brief. Eleanor had lived modestly, though the room seemed to believe every old woman must have hidden money somewhere if enough relatives waited politely. A watch went to one nephew. Quilts to a church group. Savings to a small animal clinic. A box of letters to Clara for safekeeping. Then Clara lifted the final document and looked at Nathan with an expression he could not read. "To Nathan Cole," she read, "and to the loyal shepherd who waited with me in the snow, I leave the log cabin on Hollow Ridge, assessed value $50, with all contents inside and any mercy he has the courage to continue." Silence followed. Then someone coughed into a laugh. Roy Maddox leaned back in his chair. $50, he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for every person to hear. "That cabin is not worth the gas to reach it," one of the relatives whispered. "Maybe she wanted him to have a roof. Even if it leaks." Nathan kept his face still. He had learned long ago that people can turn pity into a knife and still call it concern. $50. A cabin no one wanted. A gift that sounded like a joke to everyone but the dead woman who had written it. Clara reached into the cream envelope and removed a small brass key, a folded sheet of paper, and a photograph. The photograph showed Eleanor years younger, standing beside a rough log cabin half buried in snow, one gloved hand resting on a porch rail, her smile soft and private. Nathan took the key first. It was warm from Clara's hand, worn smooth at the teeth. Before he could unfold the paper, Atlas stood. The German shepherd stepped closer, nose lifting toward the envelope. He did not bark. He inhaled once deeply, then turned his head toward the north-facing window where rain traced crooked lines down the glass. His ears rose higher. A low whine moved through his chest, steady and certain. Clara watched him, and something in her face changed, as if she had been waiting for that exact sound. "Mrs. Whitaker said he might do that," she whispered. Nathan looked up. "What do you mean?" Clara nodded toward the folded paper. "She asked me not to explain. Only to give you that." Nathan opened it carefully. Eleanor's handwriting was delicate but firm, the ink slightly faded. There was only one sentence. "If the dog listens to the wall, believe him." The room seemed to grow smaller around the words. Roy Maddox's smile faded at the edges. Atlas remained facing the window, body still, eyes fixed beyond the wet rooftops of Hollow Creek toward the dark northern ridge. Nathan closed his fingers around the brass key. He did not yet know what waited in that $50 cabin, or why Eleanor had trusted a man who had refused even a cup of tea. But as rain whispered against the glass and Atlas gave one quiet breath toward the mountains, Nathan felt the day shift beneath him. What the room had laughed at was not a worthless inheritance. It was a door, and somewhere beyond the rain, something inside that cabin had already begun calling the dog by name. The rain had softened by the time Nathan stepped out of Clara Bennett's office, but Hollow Creek still looked as if the sky had laid a gray hand over every roof and road. He crossed Maple Street with the brass key in his pocket, the folded note tucked inside his faded army jacket, and Atlas moving beside him with the careful silence of a dog who understood that laughter could bruise even when no one raised a hand. Behind them, the law office door opened and closed as Eleanor's distant relatives drifted away under umbrellas, already done with the strange little inheritance that had not belonged to them. Roy Maddox came last, buttoning his tweed coat against the cold. "Mr. Cole," he called, his voice friendly in the way a locked gate can look friendly from a distance. Nathan stopped beside his old pickup, a dark green truck with rust along the wheel wells and a blanket folded across the bench seat for Atlas. Rainwater ran in thin lines down the windshield. Atlas stood between Nathan and Roy, not blocking him, not threatening, simply present. Roy glanced toward the dog and gave a small smile. "That ridge road is rough after weather like this," he said. "Washed out in places. Folks get turned around up there." Nathan opened the passenger door and let Atlas climb in. "I have driven worse roads." "I do not doubt that." Roy leaned one hand on his own clean truck parked by the curb. "I knew Eleanor. Fine woman. Sentimental, though. That cabin has not been fit for much in years. Roof moss, bad porch, no utilities worth naming. You would be doing yourself a favor to let someone take it off your hands before winter makes the decision for you." Nathan looked at him across the wet street. "You want to buy a $50 cabin?" Roy laughed lightly. "Land is land. Even bad land has uses if a man knows how to handle it. I can give you $500 today. Cash. No paperwork headaches. Enough for a motel room, hot meals, maybe repairs on that truck." There it was, offered like mercy and priced like surrender. Nathan had known men like Roy in different clothes, men who could smell desperation and call it opportunity. He felt the old pull of exhaustion. $500 was not nothing to a man who had counted quarters for coffee. A motel room with heat and a shower could sound like heaven when your back had learned the shape of a truck seat. But in his pocket, Eleanor's note seemed to warm against his chest. "If the dog listens to the wall, believe him." "I will see it first," Nathan said. Roy's smile thinned. "Suit yourself. Just remember, a cheap thing usually stays cheap for a reason." Nathan closed the truck door, walked around to the driver's side, and climbed in. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, amber eyes fixed toward the north, his dark service harness catching the dull afternoon light. The brass key lay heavy in Nathan's palm for a moment before he placed it in the cup holder beside the folded map Clara had given him. At the top, in Eleanor's careful handwriting, was written Hollow Ridge Road, last turn before the covered bridge. Nathan started the engine. The pickup shuddered awake, the heater blowing air that smelled faintly of dust and old pine. They drove out of Hollow Creek past a diner with fogged windows, a white church with a red door, and a hardware store displaying snow shovels before the first true snow had even come. The town fell away quickly, replaced by wet fields, stone walls, and dark stands of spruce and maple. Vermont in late autumn had a way of looking both beautiful and stern, as if every hill had learned patience from long winters. Nathan kept the speed low as the road climbed. Rain turned to mist. Mist thickened between the trees. Atlas remained still until they passed the covered bridge, its red boards darkened by weather, the river below moving fast and brown between mossy stones. Then the dog lifted one paw and placed it gently on the dashboard. His ears rose. His throat made three short, quiet sounds, not quite whines, not quite barks. Recognition. Nathan glanced at him. "You have never been here, boy." Atlas did not look back. The last turn appeared as Eleanor's map promised, a narrow dirt road almost hidden by ferns and low branches, climbing toward Hollow Ridge. Nathan turned in. The pickup rolled over ruts filled with rainwater, branches brushing the sides like fingers testing old paint. The road bent twice, then rose sharply. At the top, the trees opened just enough to reveal the cabin. It sat alone on a small shelf of land beneath tall pines, built from dark logs silvered with age. Moss covered one side of the roof. The front porch sagged at the left corner. A shutter hung loose beside a cracked window. At first glance, Roy Maddox had been right. The cabin looked tired enough to sit down and never stand again. Yet Nathan did not move. Something about it resisted the word abandoned. Firewood was stacked under a tin awning, dry and neat. A rain barrel stood beneath a gutter patched with new flashing. The chimney cap had been cleaned. A path of flat stones led from the muddy drive to the porch, half buried under wet leaves but still visible, still inviting feet toward the door. Atlas pressed his nose to the window, breathed once, then looked at Nathan with the steady seriousness that had guided them through storms, bad nights, and roads without promises. Nathan stepped out into the cold, damp air. The scent of wet pine, old smoke, and mountain earth surrounded him. He took the brass key from the truck and climbed the porch carefully, testing each board before trusting his weight. Atlas followed, paws silent on the wood, his gaze fixed on the door. The lock was stiff but not rusted through. Nathan turned the key slowly. Inside, the cabin waited in gray light. It was small, one main room with a stone fireplace, a narrow sleeping loft, a rough table, and two enamel cups placed upside down on a folded towel. A clean blanket rested over the back of a rocking chair. A glass jar on the mantel held dry matches. Beside it lay a note weighed down by a smooth river stone. Nathan picked it up. The handwriting was Eleanor's. The price was only to keep greedy hands away. Atlas walked past him before he could breathe, crossing the room to the north wall beside the fireplace. He stood there motionless, head tilted, ears high, listening to the logs. Nathan felt the cold deepen around him. Outside, mist slid through the pines. Inside, behind a wall that should have held only timber and shadow, something faint and hidden seemed to move like water far beneath the earth. Atlas stood with one paw lifted near the north wall, his head tilted toward the old logs beside the fireplace, listening with such focus that Nathan felt the room itself grow quiet out of respect. The cabin smelled of damp wool, dry cedar, cold ashes, and the faint sweetness of the matches Eleanor had sealed in the glass jar. Outside, mist threaded between the pines, softening the world beyond the windows until Hollow Ridge seemed cut off from every road Nathan had ever taken. Inside, the fire had not yet been lit, but the stone hearth held the memory of warmth. Nathan stepped closer to the wall, careful not to crowd Atlas. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. The German shepherd did not look away. His amber eyes tracked something beneath the surface of the timber, something no human ear should have noticed. Nathan pressed his palm flat against the log where Atlas was staring. At first he felt only rough wood, cold and slightly damp from age. Then, beneath that, faint as a pulse under a sleeve, came a vibration. Not strong. Not alarming. Steady. He leaned closer and heard it then, the distant murmur of running water, so soft it could have been mistaken for wind if a man had wanted not to believe. But there was no plumbing in the cabin. No working sink. No pipe crossing that wall. He remembered Eleanor's note from the law office. If the dog listens to the wall, believe him. Nathan swallowed. All right, he said. I believe him. Atlas lowered his paw and shifted 2 feet to the left, then scratched gently at the seam between 2 logs. His claws made a dry clicking sound, patient and exact. Nathan set his duffel on the floor and pulled out a small roll of tools he carried everywhere: screwdriver, folding knife, pliers, tape, flashlight. He had learned in the Army Corps of Engineers that old structures told the truth slowly. You did not force them. You listened first, then asked with the right tool. He ran the flashlight along the wall. Most logs were dark with age, but one had a slightly different grain, smoother near the center, its edges hidden by careful staining. A loose log, but not carelessly loose. Hidden. Nathan worked the blade beneath a narrow wooden plug and felt it give. Behind it was a tiny brass pin. He pulled the pin free with the pliers, and the center of the log shifted outward 1/4 of an inch. Atlas stepped back, tail low, ears high. Nathan gripped the wood and eased it open. The section was hollow. Inside, wrapped in wax cloth and tied with faded blue ribbon, lay a small bundle no bigger than a Bible. Nathan placed it on the table beneath the window. Rain ticked softly against the glass. His hands, scarred and rough from years of work, moved with unexpected gentleness as he untied the ribbon. Inside was a brass key, a folded map, a thin leather ledger, and a note in Eleanor's handwriting. A cheap cabin can hide an expensive mercy. The words stayed in the air like a candle being lit. Nathan unfolded the map. It showed the cabin from above, drawn with a precise hand: fireplace, table, rocking chair, sleeping loft, front porch, north wall. Beneath the rocking chair, Eleanor had drawn a square and labeled its cellar door. Nathan looked toward the chair. It sat near the hearth, old but polished, with the clean blanket folded across its back. He crossed the room and moved it aside. Atlas followed and sniffed the floorboards beneath. Almost immediately, he tapped one paw 3 times. Nathan crouched, brushing dust away with his sleeve. A seam appeared, square and narrow, so well fitted into the floor that he might have walked over it for years without seeing it. The brass key from the wall bundle fit into a small covered keyhole beneath a sliding knot of wood. When he turned it, the floor gave a soft click. Warm air breathed upward through the cracks. Nathan stopped, hands still on the key. The warmth touched his face with a tenderness that felt almost impossible in that cold, $50 cabin. He lifted the square panel. Below it, a narrow wooden stairway descended into amber light. Not darkness. Light. Atlas peered down first, then looked back at Nathan as if the path had been proven safe by the fact that Eleanor had expected them. Nathan took the flashlight anyway and began down. The stairs creaked but held. Atlas followed close behind, careful and sure. At the bottom, Nathan found a cellar larger than the cabin should have allowed, dry-walled in stone, supported with clean beams, and warmed by a small wood stove connected to a hidden flue. Shelves lined the walls: canned soup, blankets, socks, water filters, first aid kits, dog food, lanterns, batteries, folded coats. Everything labeled. Everything orderly. On the far wall, painted in white letters, were 4 words that stopped him completely: warmth first. Questions later. Nathan stood there with his mouth slightly open, feeling the meaning arrive piece by piece. This was not a storage room. This was a refuge. Someone had built mercy under the floorboards and priced the cabin low enough for greedy men to overlook it. Atlas moved to a low shelf near the stove and nosed open a wooden box. Inside were dog blankets, collars, bowls, and a bag of treats sealed tight against the damp. The shepherd sat beside it with solemn approval. Nathan gave a breath that nearly became a laugh and nearly became something else. "She thought of you too," he said softly. On a small desk beneath a lantern, the leather ledger waited. Nathan opened it. The first pages held dates going back decades. Names. Weather conditions. Notes written in Eleanor's hand and sometimes another hand, older and heavier. Truck driver, January storm, stayed 6 hours, left before dawn. Mother with 2 children, heater failed, gave blankets and soup. Veteran was shepherd, refused tea, accepted biscuit, pride colder than snow. Nathan froze. He read the line again. Veteran was shepherd. Refused tea. Accepted biscuit. He was in the book. Eleanor had not forgotten a stranger who changed a tire and drove away. She had written him into the history of everyone the cabin had kept alive. Atlas leaned gently against his leg, and Nathan rested one hand on the dog's head. Above them, the wind moved through the pines. Below the floor of a cabin the world had valued at $50, Nathan understood that he had not inherited a ruin. He had inherited a record of kindness, and somewhere inside those pages was the reason Eleanor had chosen him to keep it going. Nathan stayed in the hidden cellar long after the first shock had passed, seated at the small desk beneath the lantern, while Atlas rested near the stove with his ears half raised and his amber eyes watching every movement. The room beneath the cabin had a stillness unlike any shelter Nathan had known. It did not smell of neglect or pity. It smelled of cedar shelves, dry wool, canned soup, old paper, and the faint iron scent of mountain water moving somewhere behind stone. Warmth first. Questions later. The words on the wall seemed simple, almost plain, but the longer Nathan looked at them, the more they felt like a sermon Eleanor had been living for decades without ever needing a pulpit. He opened the leather ledger again and turned the pages carefully. Each entry was written with the tenderness of someone who believed a name mattered even when the world had stopped using it kindly. A lineman stranded in an ice storm. A mother whose car would not start. A college kid who got lost hiking before Thanksgiving. A widower who slept by the stove and left a note saying he had not been warm in 3 days. A veteran with a shepherd who refused tea because pride was colder than snow. Nathan read that line until the ink blurred. He remembered that night now with painful clarity, Eleanor standing beside her Buick in a red wool hat, Atlas sitting in the snow between them, the tire iron cold in Nathan's hands, the old woman's voice asking him to come inside for tea as if she were offering something ordinary. He had smiled, refused, taken the biscuit only because she had pressed it into Atlas's harness pouch, and said, "Then let your friend carry it." He had driven away thinking he had spared himself embarrassment. Eleanor had written him down as if he had mattered. Atlas rose and walked to the far wall where the sound of water was strongest. He did not paw or whine. He only listened. Nathan followed, running his flashlight along the stone. Behind a stack of folded wool blankets, a narrow wooden door blended into the wall. It had no handle, only a small brass latch and a carved mark shaped like a drop of water. The key from the hollow log turned easily. Beyond the door was a short passage carved into the rock, ending at a spring basin no wider than a washtub. Clear water slipped from a stone seam into a covered channel, then flowed away beneath the floor through a pipe system so old and clever that Nathan found himself smiling despite the ache in his chest. Eleanor had not only built a warm room. She had protected water. Clean water, hidden under a cabin no one valued. On a shelf beside the basin sat a sealed envelope marked Nathan. He opened it with damp fingers. "My husband found this spring the first winter after we married," Eleanor had written. "He said God sometimes hides the most necessary things where proud people will not bother to look. We kept the cabin cheap on paper because certain men in Hollow Creek valued land more than lives. If you are reading this, then Atlas has heard what I hoped he would hear. The spring, the cabin, and the ridge path are protected in a charitable trust. Clara has the public copy. The full copy is in the desk drawer beneath the ledger. Use it when someone tries to make mercy look foolish. Nathan lowered the letter. Water whispered beside him, steady and pure. He thought of Roy Maddox outside the law office, offering $500 with a smile that had already measured the land. He thought of the way Roy had said, "A cheap thing usually stays cheap for a reason." Maybe Eleanor had known exactly what kind of men would come sniffing at the ridge once she was gone. Maybe the $50 assessment had not been shame. It had been camouflage. Atlas nudged Nathan's hand, then turned back toward the cellar. At the desk, Nathan found the drawer Eleanor mentioned. Inside was a blue folder sealed in plastic, a county map, old photographs, and legal papers signed, stamped, and organized with the quiet discipline of a woman who had outlived everyone who underestimated her. The trust named the cabin as Hollow Ridge Winter Refuge, maintained for emergency shelter, clean water access, and temporary care for travelers, homeless residents, veterans, and their animals during severe weather. Nathan sat down slowly. He had expected a mystery. He had not expected a responsibility. The cabin was not asking him to become rich. It was asking him to keep a door open. Above him, the wind shifted. The old logs creaked, and through the cellar ceiling came a faint thump from the porch. Atlas stood instantly, ears high. Nathan slid the trust papers back into the folder and tucked it under his arm. Another sound followed, a vehicle outside, tires pressing into wet gravel. The cabin door opened before Nathan reached the stairs. Roy Maddox's voice drifted down through the floorboards, smooth and too cheerful. "Mr. Cole? I thought I might save you a cold night up here." Nathan looked at Atlas. The German shepherd was already at the foot of the stairs, calm, steady, waiting. Nathan climbed first, closing the cellar panel behind them and sliding the rocking chair back into place. The main room had dimmed with late afternoon. Roy stood near the fireplace in his tweed coat, rain beating on his shoulders, his eyes moving too quickly over the room, the wall, the floor, the chair. He held a folder in one hand. "You should not leave the door unlocked," Roy said. Nathan placed Eleanor's blue folder on the table beside the two enamel cups. "I did not." Roy's smile paused, then returned. "Old latch must have slipped. Happens with cheap cabins." Atlas stepped beside Nathan and sat, black and tan coat catching the fireless gray light, dark service harness still damp from the day. He did not growl. He did not need to. Nathan looked at the north wall, at the hidden spring behind stone, at the floor that held decades of warmth beneath it. Then he looked back at Roy. "You came a long way to check on something you said was not worth the gas." Roy's eyes flicked to the blue folder. "I came to make a better offer." Outside, mist pressed against the windows. Inside, the cabin seemed to listen. Roy Maddox placed his folder on the table with the careful confidence of a man who believed paper could make almost anything sound reasonable. The cabin had grown darker around them, the late afternoon mist pressing against the windows, the stone fireplace cold, the two enamel cups sitting upside down on their folded towel as if Eleanor had left them there to witness what came next. Nathan stood across from Roy with Eleanor's blue folder beneath one hand and Atlas seated at his side, the German shepherd's black and tan coat damp from the ridge air, his amber eyes steady, his dark service harness quiet against his chest. Roy looked at Atlas first, then at the north wall, then at the rocking chair that now hid the cellar door again. "500 was too low," he said, opening his folder. "I admit that. I did not want to overwhelm you before you understood the burden." Nathan said nothing. Silence had served him better than anger in rooms where other men expected him to defend his worth. Roy removed a printed purchase agreement and turned it toward him. $5,000. Today. You sign, I handle the transfer, the taxes, the cleanup, everything. You walk away with money in your pocket and no winter problem hanging over your head. The number landed heavier than Nathan wanted it to. $5,000 meant repairs on the pickup, a motel room for more than a week, groceries without counting coins, a coat without torn lining, maybe even a phone that held a charge longer than a prayer. He felt the temptation not as greed, but as exhaustion wearing a clean shirt. Atlas shifted beside him, pressing one shoulder lightly against Nathan's leg. It was not a command. It was a reminder. Nathan looked down at the dog, then at the note on the mantel beside the river stone. The price was only to keep greedy hands away. Why? Nathan asked. Roy blinked. Why what? Why offer $5,000 for a cabin you said was not worth the gas? Roy smiled again, but the corners had begun to work harder. Because land can be improved. Because I have equipment, contacts, investors. Because some men see what a place could become. Nathan opened Eleanor's blue folder and slid the trust papers across the table. She already saw what it could become. Roy's eyes dropped to the page. His expression changed only slightly, but Nathan had spent enough years watching people read bad news to recognize the moment. The trust was real. Signed. Stamped. Protected. This complicates things, Roy said. It clarifies them. Charitable language can be challenged if the property is unsafe or underfunded. Then I will make it safe. Roy gave a soft laugh. With what? A duffel bag and a service dog? The words were meant to sting. They did, but not where Roy expected. They touched the old wound Nathan had carried from shelter lines and winter parking lots, the belief that a man with little could not be trusted with much. But beneath that wound, something steadier had begun to rise. Eleanor's ledger. The hidden spring. The shelves of blankets. Atlas listening to the wall. With help, Nathan said. Roy leaned closer. Help is unreliable. Weather is not. Snow closes that road by December. Pipes freeze. Roofs fail. People talk warmly until work gets hard. Then they go home. Nathan thought of Eleanor carrying supplies down the cellar stairs year after her husband died. He thought of her writing names in the ledger, not because anyone thanked her publicly, but because being remembered mattered. Some people stay, he said. Roy's gaze moved again toward the floor near the rocking chair. You found something down there. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Atlas lifted his head. Nathan did not answer quickly. He let the question show itself for what it was. You knew there was something to find. Roy straightened. There are rumors. Old spring lines. Timber access. Possible county easement. Nothing a man like you needs tangled around his neck. A man like me. You know what I mean. I do. The simplicity of the reply made Roy look away first. Outside, a crow crossed the clearing and vanished into the pines. The sound of water behind the wall continued faintly, steady and hidden, like the cabin's pulse. Nathan gathered the purchase agreement and placed it back in Roy's folder without signing. No. Roy's face cooled. Think carefully. I have. You could regret this by the first heavy snow. Maybe. Nathan rested his hand on Atlas's head. But I would regret selling it sooner. For a long moment, Roy stood motionless in the dim cabin, a man used to doors opening because he had learned which hinges to push. This one did not open. At last he took the folder, slid the blue trust papers back with one finger, as if they had offended him, and buttoned his coat. Call Clara Bennett if you change your mind. She knows where to reach me. I will be calling Clara, Nathan said. Not for that. Roy's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. He stepped onto the porch, boots sounding hollow against the old boards, then walked through the mist to his truck. Nathan stood in the doorway with Atlas beside him until the taillights disappeared down the ridge road. Only then did the cabin release its quiet. Nathan closed the door, turned the latch firmly, and leaned his forehead against the wood for a moment. He was tired, hungry, uncertain, and responsible for more than he understood. Yet beneath the fear was a small, stubborn warmth that had not been there that morning. He took out his phone. The signal was weak, one bar flickering like a candle, but it held long enough. Clara answered on the third ring. Mr. Cole? I found the cellar, Nathan said. There was a pause, then Clara's breath caught softly. Eleanor hoped you would. Roy Maddox was here. I was afraid he might be. Nathan looked toward the rocking chair, the hidden door beneath it, the north wall where water whispered behind stone. I need to know how to keep this legal and safe. Clara's voice steadied. Then we begin tonight. I will call the county outreach office. I know a retired building inspector who owed Eleanor more favors than he ever admitted. Do not leave the cabin if you can help it. Nathan glanced at Atlas, who had already returned to the north wall and settled there like a guardian beside a secret spring. We are not leaving, he said. After the call, Nathan lit the first fire in the fireplace. The match flared gold, caught the kindling, and sent warmth slowly into the room above the hidden refuge. He opened the ledger again at the table and placed Eleanor's note beside it. Page after page, names weighted in ink, travelers, widows, veterans, families, dogs, strangers who had once been cold and then, for a little while, were not. Near the back of the book was a blank page. Nathan stared at it for a long time. Then he wrote the date, his own name, Atlas's name, and one sentence beneath them: We found the Mercy, and we will keep it warm. The fire crackled softly. Atlas lifted his head from beside the wall. Outside, the first wet snow of the season began to mix with the rain, touching the windows like small white hands asking to come in. The first snow did not fall hard, but it changed the cabin by morning. It softened the moss on the roof, whitened the porch rail, and turned the pines around Hollow Ridge into tall, silent witnesses. Nathan woke before dawn on the floor beside the fireplace, his faded army jacket folded under his head, the old blanket from Eleanor's rocking chair pulled over his shoulders. The fire had burned low, leaving red coals breathing under gray ash. Atlas lay between Nathan and the north wall, black and tan coat warm in the firelight, dark service harness resting beside him, amber eyes opening the moment Nathan moved. For a few seconds Nathan forgot where he was. Then the smell of cedar, smoke, old logs, and mountain cold returned, and with it the memory of the hidden cellar, the spring behind stone, Roy Maddox's offer, and the blank ledger page where he had written his promise. We found the Mercy, and we will keep it warm. He sat up slowly, listening. Beneath the floor, the cellar hummed with quiet heat. Behind the wall, water whispered as it had whispered all night, steady as prayer. Nathan fed the stove, boiled water in a blackened kettle, and made coffee from a small tin he found on the shelf. It was bitter, but it was hot, and for a man who had spent too many mornings drinking gas station coffee gone lukewarm in a paper cup, it tasted almost like grace. Just after 7, headlights appeared through the snowy trees. Atlas stood at once, ears high, but his posture stayed calm. A blue Subaru climbed the ridge road carefully, and stopped beside Nathan's pickup. Clara Bennett stepped out wearing a heavy wool coat, boots, and a knit hat pulled low over her ears. Behind her came an older man in a canvas jacket, carrying a tool bag and a clipboard sealed in a plastic sleeve. Clara waved from the clearing. Mr. Cole, this is Henry Walsh. He inspected half the old cabins in this county before he retired, and Eleanor once made him 3 pies after he fixed her chimney permit. Henry Walsh looked up at the cabin and gave a dry little nod. Best pies in Vermont, he said. So I figured I owed her one more morning. Nathan met them on the porch with Atlas beside him. Shane tried to rise again at the sight of the sagging boards and cracked window, but it did not find the same room inside him. This was not a failure on display. This was work beginning. Clara stepped inside first, pausing when she saw the 2 enamel cups, the note on the mantel, and the ledger open on the table. Her eyes softened, but she did not make a show of it. Henry inspected the main room with the practical silence of a man who trusted beams more than opinions. He checked the roofline, the fireplace draft, the floor joists, the loft ladder, the front steps, the north wall, and finally the hidden panel beneath the rocking chair. When Nathan opened it, warm amber light rose from below, and Henry looked at Clara over the top of his glasses. Well, he said. Eleanor, you sly old fox. Down in the cellar, Henry moved slowly from shelf to shelf, tapping support posts, checking vents, studying the water channel and the hidden flue. Clara stood under the word's warmth first. Questions later and read them with one hand against her chest. Atlas walked directly to the dog's supplies and sat as if presenting evidence. Henry crouched near the spring passage, listened to the water, then stood with a grunt. "It is not ready for public use as is," he said. Nathan nodded, expecting the words to close the door. Henry continued. "But it is a long way from unsafe. Ventilation needs improvement. Secondary exit needs clearing. Porch needs bracing. Smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, railing repair, fresh gravel on the upper road. Do those, and the county can consider emergency winter refuge approval for limited use." Nathan let the sentence settle. Limited use. Not no. Not impossible. A small legal opening through which warmth could pass. Clara smiled faintly. "Eleanor thought you might say that." Henry pointed at the shelves. "She thought of most things. I am annoyed by how little I get to complain." By noon, Hollow Ridge had begun to gather help. Clara called the county outreach office from the porch where the signal held strongest. Henry marked boards with chalk and wrote a repair list on the back of an envelope. Nathan split kindling from the dry wood pile and cleared snow from the stone path. Atlas moved between them with solemn purpose, occasionally stopping at the north wall to listen, as though making sure the spring still approved. The first visitor came near mid-afternoon, not because the refuge was open yet, but because Clara had made one careful call. His name was Martin Pike, a 72-year-old veteran who had been staying in a church basement in Hollow Creek with an old beagle named Rosie. He arrived in the county outreach van, wearing a patched brown coat and carrying a grocery bag with 2 shirts inside. Rosie stepped down slowly, nose lifted toward the cabin's smoke, then toward Atlas. Nathan walked to meet them before Martin could apologize for needing anything. He knew that apology. He had carried it in his own mouth too many winters. "I am Nathan," he said. "This is Atlas." Martin looked at the cabin, then at the dog, then at the snow beginning again in small flakes. "They said there might be coffee." Nathan opened the door wider. "There is coffee. And soup warming." Martin's eyes lowered, not from weakness, but from the difficulty of receiving a thing without being asked to pay for it in dignity. Rosie gave one tired wag. Atlas stepped forward and touched noses with her, gentle as a blessing. Henry cleared his throat behind them. "Temporary warming visit," he said to Clara, pretending his voice had not softened. "Not overnight occupancy yet." Clara nodded. "Of course." But when Martin sat near the fireplace with both hands around a mug, and Rosie curled on the blanket beside Atlas, the cabin seemed to understand the difference between law and mercy. One moved carefully. The other opened the door first. As dusk settled blue over Hollow Ridge, Nathan wrote Martin and Rosie's names in Eleanor's ledger under his own. He did not call them residents. "Not yet," he wrote, first warmth shared. Outside, snow touched the windows and melted. Inside, the fire burned clean, the hidden spring whispered behind the wall, and a $50 cabin began becoming priceless, 1 cup of coffee at a time. By the third morning, the cabin no longer felt as if it belonged only to the past. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, damp boots drying near the hearth, and the clean mineral breath of the hidden spring behind the north wall. Snow had stopped before dawn, leaving Hollow Ridge bright under a pale sky, every pine branch holding white along its needles. Nathan woke on the floor beside the fireplace with Atlas stretched near the door, one amber eye opening the moment the first truck climbed the ridge road. The repairs began before breakfast. Henry Walsh arrived with 2 sawhorses, a box of smoke alarms, and the expression of a man who had already decided the cabin would pass inspection if stubbornness counted as a building material. Clara Bennett came with folders, thermoses, and a stack of printed forms clipped in careful order. Pastor Jonah Reed from the White Church in Hollow Creek brought gravel shovels, 3 volunteers, and a pot of stew wrapped in towels on the seat beside him. Martin Pike sat by the hearth with Rosie the old beagle curled at his feet, pretending to read one of Eleanor's paperbacks while watching every person who entered as if kindness might still turn around and leave. Nathan saw that watchfulness and understood it. He had worn it in diners, shelters, gas stations, and waiting rooms where warmth came with rules too small for a tired soul to fit through. Atlas moved from room to room with quiet authority, sniffing tool bags, pausing beside the open cellar panel, then returning to the north wall whenever the spring murmured louder. It was Henry who first noticed the dog's pattern. "That shepherd keeps checking the water like he owns it," he said, tightening a railing bolt near the porch. Nathan looked toward Atlas, who stood with his ear near the log wall. "Maybe he knows it is the reason this place is still alive," Henry grunted. "Then he knows more than most committees." By noon, the porch no longer shifted underfoot. Smoke alarms blinked red from their brackets. The secondary exit from the cellar had been cleared through a low stone hatch behind the cabin, hidden beneath brush Eleanor had let grow thick for privacy. Pastor Jonah and the volunteers spread gravel over the worst stretch of the upper road, their breath steaming as they worked. Clara sat at the table with the leather ledger open, carefully comparing Eleanor's notes with the trust papers. Every so often, she would pause and run one finger over a name, as though touching a prayer someone had forgotten they left behind. Near the back of the ledger, she found a folded photograph tucked between two pages. "Nathan," she said softly. He came over, wiping sawdust from his hands. The photograph showed Eleanor and her late husband standing in front of the cabin decades earlier. He was tall, wearing a wool cap and suspenders, one hand on the porch rail. Eleanor was younger, smiling into a snowfall, holding a lantern high. On the back, in her handwriting, were the words, "Charles said the cabin was not ours unless strangers could survive a storm inside it." Nathan studied the picture, then looked at the room around him. The two enamel cups. The blanket on the rocking chair. The cellar stairs. The shelves of food and dog blankets. All of it had been a marriage made visible, love turned into wood, stone, labels, and firewood. Clara folded the photograph back into the ledger. She waited a long time to find someone who would not sell the heart out of it. Nathan looked down. "I almost thought about it." "Of course you did," Clara said. "You were cold, hungry, and offered money. Thinking is not failing." Atlas came to Nathan's side then and pressed his shoulder against his leg, as if agreeing with Clara in the only language he needed. Late in the afternoon, just as the light began to turn gold across the snow, Roy Maddox's truck appeared at the bottom of the ridge road. No one spoke when it came into view. The volunteers kept shoveling, but slower. Henry stood on the porch with his clipboard against his chest. Clara closed the ledger and rose. Roy parked near the woodpile and stepped out wearing polished boots that looked wrong against the snow. His eyes moved over the gravel, the repaired porch, the cleared hatch, the people, the smoke from the chimney. For the first time, he looked less amused than uncertain. "Busy place," he said. Nathan stepped down from the porch, Atlas beside him. "It is getting there." Roy looked toward Clara. "I heard you were rushing this into county use." Clara's voice remained calm. "We are following the trust and the emergency winter protocols. There are access issues." Henry lifted his clipboard. "Being addressed. Water rights?" Clara tapped the blue folder on the table visible through the open door. "Protected." Roy's mouth tightened. He looked at Nathan. "You do realize this will become work you cannot walk away from." Nathan glanced back at Martin inside by the fire, Rosie asleep near Atlas's blanket, Pastor Jonah carrying stew to the table, Clara standing beneath Eleanor's old photograph. "I have walked away from enough," he said. The words were not sharp. They did not need to be. Roy looked as if he wanted to answer, but the cabin had changed since he last entered it. It was harder to call something worthless while smoke rose from its chimney and people stood around it with tools in their hands. He turned toward the pines instead. "Road still closes hard in February." Pastor Jonah leaned on his shovel. "Then we will plow it," Henry added. "And salt it," Clara said. "And document it." Martin, from inside near the fire, spoke without looking up from his book. "And drink coffee after." A small laugh moved through the porch, gentle and unexpected. Even Roy heard it. His face shifted, not softened exactly, but unsettled by the sound of a place becoming harder to buy because it was becoming loved. He left soon after, saying he would review the matter with his attorney, but his words no longer carried the weight they had the day before. When his truck disappeared down the road, Nathan felt no victory, only relief and a deeper kind of responsibility. At dusk, Henry signed the temporary safety checklist for limited overnight use once the final detector was installed. Clara made the call to the county office. Pastor Jonah ladled stew into bowls. Martin and Rosie were allowed to stay the night in the cellar, officially this time, and a second cot was prepared in case the outreach office sent someone else before morning. Nathan wrote the update in Eleanor's ledger by lantern light, porch braced. Exit cleared. First overnight approved. Mercy still warm. Atlas rested beside his chair, eyes half closed. Outside, snow began again, soft and steady. Inside, the cabin held its warmth without asking who deserved it. And Nathan understood, as the firelight touched the old logs, that a refuge is not born when every form is signed or every board is straight. It begins the moment someone cold knocks, and someone inside decides to open the door. By morning, the first true winter clouds had settled over Hollow Ridge, heavy and blue-gray, promising more snow before nightfall. Nathan woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke, surprised for a moment that he was not the one who had made either. Martin Pike stood at the stove in his patched coat, stirring oatmeal in a dented pot while Rosie slept near the hearth with her nose tucked under one paw. Atlas lay beside the north wall, black and tan coat warm in the firelight, amber eyes open and listening to the spring behind the logs. The cabin no longer felt like an empty thing waiting to be judged. It sounded alive now, the soft click of the stove, the murmur of water below, the scrape of a chair leg, the wind whirring at the eaves, the breathing of two dogs who had decided the room was safe enough for sleep. Nathan sat up from his place near the fireplace, his faded army jacket folded beneath his head, and found Martin watching him with a half-smile. "Coffee is strong," the older man said. "Oatmeal is honest. That is about the best I can offer." Nathan rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble along his jaw. "That is more than enough." They ate at the small table with Eleanor's ledger between them and the two enamel cups still turned upside down on their folded towel. Martin did not ask questions about Nathan's past, and Nathan did not ask why Martin's hands trembled slightly around the mug. Some stories entered a room slowly. A warm place gave them time. Just after 8, Clara Bennett arrived with Joanne from the county outreach office and a woman named Grace Miller, a nurse who volunteered with the church clinic. Behind them came Pastor Jonah with a box of donated gloves, Henry Walsh with more tools, and a young deputy named Sam Keller who had come only to check the access road and ended up carrying firewood without being asked. The ridge filled with quiet purpose. No one moved like a crowd. They moved like neighbors who knew the weather was larger than any one person and had chosen not to let it win alone. Joanne reviewed the temporary overnight approval and placed a simple intake form on the table, 1 page only. Name, emergency contact if they have one, medical concerns if they want to share, animal needs if applicable, she said. No interrogation. Eleanor would haunt me if I made this harder than the cold. Clara laughed softly, and the sound warmed the cabin almost as much as the stove. Nathan appreciated that Joanne said if they want to share. He had known too many systems that wanted proof of pain before offering a blanket. By noon, the cellar had been prepared for 2 overnight guests, with a third cot folded nearby in case the storm turned worse. The dog blankets were laid near the stovepipe, water bowls filled, lantern batteries checked, and the secondary exit cleared again after the night's drifting snow. Atlas followed every step, occasionally touching his nose to a folded blanket or pausing by the cellar stairs as if approving Eleanor's order of things. Around mid-afternoon, the county van climbed the ridge with careful tires and stopped near the stone path. A woman stepped out first, late 60s, small and straight-backed, wearing a blue knit cap and carrying a canvas bag. Beside her came an old black and white border collie with clouded eyes and a red bandana. The woman's name was Ruth Ann Hensley. She had been living in her station wagon after the room she rented above a diner lost heat, and the owner closed the building for repairs. She stood in the snow looking at the cabin light as if it were a trick that might vanish if she trusted it. Nathan walked down the steps with Atlas beside him. "I am Nathan," he said. "This is Atlas." Ruth and looked at the German shepherd, then at the cabin. "They said I could come until the storm passed." "You can. My dog comes with me." "Of course." The border collie leaned toward Atlas, sniffing the cold air. Atlas lowered his head and touched noses with him, gentle and slow. Ruth Ann's face changed at that small kindness more than at anything Nathan had said. "His name is Charlie," she murmured. "He is old, but he is polite." "Then Charlie gets the good blanket," Martin called from the porch, and Ruth Ann laughed once, surprised by the sound coming out of her own mouth. Inside, Grace checked Ruth Ann's hands for cold while Joanne helped her fill out the simple form. No one hurried her. No one asked her to explain why life had become difficult in front of strangers. Charlie settled near Rosie, and Atlas lay between them like a quiet host. As evening approached, snow began to fall harder, thick flakes turning the windows white at the edges. The cabin filled with stew, coffee, damp wool, and a low murmur of people learning one another's names. Nathan stood near the north wall listening to the hidden spring, feeling the strange ache of watching Eleanor's dream take shape faster than his fear could stop it. Clara came to stand beside him. "You know Roy filed a notice this morning," she said softly. Nathan looked at her. "To challenge the trust? To question access and valuation. It will not hold if the documents are as strong as I believe they are, but he is trying." Nathan looked toward the table, where Ruth Ann was feeding Charlie a small piece of biscuit, and Martin was pretending not to enjoy having company. "What do we do?" Clara's eyes moved to the ledger. "We document what this place is doing. Carefully. Honestly. We let the truth become heavier than his argument." Nathan nodded. He understood that. He had carried heavy things before. Some were finally worth carrying. Later, after supper, Henry came in from checking the road with snow on his eyebrows. "Storm is settling in," he said. "Nobody should drive down tonight unless they have to." Pastor Jonah looked at Nathan. "Then I will take the loft floor if there is room." Deputy Sam raised a hand. "I can sleep in my cruiser. Done it before." Ruth Ann frowned at him. "Nonsense. You carried firewood all afternoon. You can have the rocking chair." The cabin went quiet for half a second, then everyone laughed gently, even Sam. Nathan felt the sound move through the logs, down into the cellar, across the hidden spring, and back up through the room like warmth finding every crack. That night, Martin and Ruth Ann slept in the cellar with Rosie and Charlie. Pastor Jonah took the loft floor with a spare quilt. Sam dozed in the rocking chair near the fire after losing the argument. Clara and Joanne drove down before the road worsened, promising to return at first light. Nathan stayed awake later than the others, sitting at the table with Eleanor's ledger open. Atlas rested at his feet, his head on Nathan's boot. Nathan wrote carefully beneath the previous entry, "Second night, storm on Hollow Ridge. Martin and Rosie stayed warm. Ruth Ann and Charlie arrived. Road crew sheltered safely. No one asked to prove they deserved kindness." He paused, then added, "The cabin is doing what she built it to do." When he closed the ledger, the fire had settled low, and the room breathed softly around him. Snow pressed against the windows, but it could not enter. The world outside had priced the cabin at $50. Inside, under the watch of a loyal German shepherd and the memory of an old woman who believed warmth should come before questions, Nathan began to understand that priceless things rarely announce themselves. They simply keep someone alive through the night. Morning came slowly after the storm, pale and clean, with sunlight spreading across Hollow Ridge like a hand smoothing a wrinkled blanket. Snow covered the pines, the stone path, the roof moss, and the hood of Nathan's old pickup, but the cabin chimney still sent a steady ribbon of smoke into the bright cold air. Inside, the room had the quiet disorder of a place that had protected people through the night. Mugs stood drying near the sink basin. Boots rested by the hearth. A quilt had slipped from the rocking chair where Deputy Sam had slept, and Pastor Jonah was folding it with the careful embarrassment of a man who had snored louder than he intended. Martin Pike came up from the cellar first, with Rosie stepping slowly behind him, both looking rested in a way that did not need words. Ruth and Hensley followed with Charlie at her side, the old border collie moving stiffly but happily after a warm night near the stovepipe. Atlas stood by the north wall, black and tan coat glowing in the morning firelight, amber eyes bright, dark service harness already fastened as if he knew the day had more work waiting. Nathan stood at the table with Eleanor's ledger open, reading the entry he had written before sleep finally found him. No one asked to prove they deserved kindness. He touched the page once, then closed the book gently. By mid-morning, Clara Bennett and Joanne returned with Henry Walsh and the blue Subaru, climbing the ridge road behind the town plow. Their boots carried snow into the cabin, along with cold air, county papers, and a kind of cautious excitement Clara could not quite hide. Roy Maddox had filed his notice, but Eleanor's trust had been stronger than his claim. The spring rights were recorded. The access language was old but valid. The charitable purpose was clear. Most importantly, the ledger gave the cabin a history no appraisal could erase. Clara laid the papers on the table beside the two enamel cups and smiled through tired eyes. "He can argue valuation," she said. "He cannot argue that this place has served the public good for decades. Not with these records. Not with witnesses. Not with the county already documenting emergency use." Nathan looked at the paper, then around the room, Martin pouring coffee for Ruth and Sam stacking firewood by the door, Pastor Jonah checking the road report, Henry tapping the porch post with his knuckles as if personally offended by every week board in Vermont. "So it stays?" Nathan asked. Clara's face softened. "It stays." The words entered the cabin quietly, but they changed everything. Ruth uncovered her mouth. Martin lowered his head. Joanne looked toward the cellar stairs and blinked hard. Atlas walked to Nathan and leaned against his leg, steady and warm. For the first time, Nathan let himself believe that the place would not be taken from under the people who had just begun to trust it. Over the next weeks, Hollow Ridge became a rhythm. Henry returned with lumber, flashing, and an endless supply of opinions about old carpentry. Pastor Jonah organized volunteers from town who came in pairs, never making speeches, just fixing, sanding, hauling, cooking, and leaving behind more than they found. Joanne helped create simple rules that protected dignity instead of burying it. Clara filed every document, as if she were building a wall no greedy hand could push through. Martin stayed on as the first caretaker, keeping the stove clean and the coffee strong. Ruth mended curtains, labeled food shelves, and taught everyone that Charlie preferred his blanket folded twice. Nathan slept less in the pickup and more in the cabin, though at first he kept his duffel bag by the door. Habits formed in uncertainty do not vanish just because someone offers a bed. Atlas was patient with him. Each night, the German shepherd lay between Nathan and the north wall, listening to the spring as if it were an old friend telling the cabin to keep breathing. The town changed too, though not all at once. Some people still called it Eleanor's old cabin. Others began calling it the Ridge Refuge. A few, quietly, called it a miracle. Roy Maddox did not come back for nearly a month. When he finally did, he arrived without his folder. He stood at the edge of the clearing while snow melted from the branches above him, and watched two volunteers carry a new handrail onto the porch. Nathan walked down the stone path with Atlas beside him. Roy looked older in daylight, less polished, as if the winter had sanded something from him. "I came to say I withdrew the notice," he said. Nathan nodded. "Clara told me?" Roy's eyes moved to the cabin windows, glowing with amber light though the day was still bright. "Eleanor once let my father sleep here during a storm," he said. "I found his name in the ledger after Clara made the copy public. I did not know." Nathan waited. Roy took a slow breath. "I priced the land." She remembered the man. It was not a perfect apology, but it was a true sentence, and sometimes truth is the first board in a bridge. Roy reached into his coat and handed Nathan an envelope. There is a gravel account at the quarry. Use it for the access road. No charge. Nathan accepted it. Thank you. Roy nodded, then looked down at Atlas. Your dog always look like he knows more than everybody? Nathan rested a hand on Atlas's head. Most days he does. Roy almost smiled before turning back toward his truck. By late winter, the cabin was officially listed with the county as Hollow Ridge Winter Refuge. A small wooden sign hung beside the door, carved by Henry and painted by Ruth and in deep green letters. The cellar beds were limited, safe, and warm. The spring was tested and approved. The porch stood straight. The fireplace drew clean. A shelf near the door held dog towels, spare gloves, and a jar of wrapped biscuits because Nathan insisted no one should leave hungry if a dog could carry kindness once. On the first clear evening after the approval letter arrived, everyone gathered outside while snow glowed blue beneath the setting sun. Martin held Rosie's leash. Ruth and stood with Charlie wrapped in a plaid dog coat. Clara, Joanne, Henry, Pastor Jonah, Sam, and half a dozen volunteers stood along the stone path. Nathan placed the original $50 assessment in a simple frame and set it on the mantel, not as shame, but as a reminder. Then he opened Eleanor's ledger to a new page and wrote the official name of the refuge, the date, and beneath it, one line: the world priced the cabin low, but it never knew how many lives were warm inside. That night, long after the others had gone and the cabin settled into its soft winter sounds, Nathan stepped onto the porch with Atlas. Stars burned over Hollow Ridge. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Behind the north wall, the hidden spring whispered through stone, still moving, still giving, still unseen by anyone who did not know how to listen. Nathan thought of Eleanor in the snow, offering tea to a proud man who could not yet accept warmth. He thought of the biscuit she had tucked into Atlas's harness, the ledger lines she had written, the trust she had prepared, the mercy she had hidden in plain sight. Atlas leaned against him, shoulder warm against his leg. Nathan looked through the window at Martin asleep near the fire, Rosie curled beside him, the ledger on the table, the two enamel cups waiting for whoever came next. He had inherited a cabin the world called almost worthless. But the world had been looking at the walls, not the welcome. And on Hollow Ridge, where snow covered the road and light held steady in the pines, Nathan finally understood that the most priceless things do not glitter. They open their doors in the cold.